I want to preface this story by stating that I have a fear of driving. I think it's mostly due to an accident I got into when I was 17 and just learning how to drive. But whatever the origin, I've avoided driving ever since. I usually take the bus wherever I need to go. I live in a big city where there's not a lot of free parking, so buses are how most of us get around. Not to mention it's cheap. I don't think I could afford gas prices even if I didn't have this fear of driving. I work at a popular cafe that stays open pretty late. On nights that I have to stay until 10, I either get a ride home from my friend or call an Uber to come pick me up. The bus times aren't great, and it usually involves me waiting with weirdos when I just want to get home. To be honest, even if I didn't have to wait, I would probably still take an Uber because I only lived 7 minutes away from home by car, but 30 minutes by bus. Most days, those 30 minutes weren't an issue, but I'm a woman, and taking a bus that late at night is pretty terrifying. I know what you're thinking, that getting into a car with someone I didn't know in exchange for money wasn't exactly safe either. Listen, both options suck, but with the Uber, I would get dropped off in front of my apartment rather than having to walk 10 minutes home after I got off the bus. Uber isn't the best option, but it's what I got. One night, I was working the late shift at the cafe and was closing up with my friend. She offered to give me a ride that night, but since I had already accepted a ride from her every day that week, I didn't feel right accepting and told her I'd just take an Uber. She tried to insist I take the ride, not wanting me to feel awkward for asking, so I made an excuse that I was meeting a friend in the opposite direction. This appeased her enough that she didn't keep pushing to give me a ride. Knowing what happened after, I wish I had said yes to her offer. My friend left after work, and I waited in the empty parking lot for my Uber. My app showed that a white car was going to pick me up in 5 minutes. Less than a minute after calling my Uber, a white car pulled up, and I saw on the front of the window an Uber sign. The car didn't have a front plate, so I started walking toward the back of the car when the window rolled down and a man called out my name. He then asked what his name was. When I said the name the app gave me, he nodded and told me I could get into the front seat if I wanted. I got into the front seat since it was going to be just a short trip. The Uber driver, for the most part, was a kind older man, about my father's age. He made me feel comfortable by asking questions that were non-invasive, but still kept the conversation going in a lighthearted way. When I saw on his GPS map that I was less than 1 minute from my apartment, I started wrapping up the conversation, thanking him for his kindness and good conversation. The man smiled at me and told me that I reminded him of his late wife, who had passed just the year before. He then asked me if I was married myself, to which I told him I wasn't. He then asked me if I had a roommate that could walk me inside from the parking lot since it was dark out. That struck me as odd, but I told him no. When he asked if I had a dog, I again didn't see anything wrong with admitting I wanted to get one, but didn't have one. Finally, we arrived at my place. He asked me for the code to get into my gated apartment, and I rattled it off as I made sure I had all my bags gathered together. When he pulled up outside my building, I got out, thanking him for the ride again. He replied saying, "It was great seeing you again, Sydney. I'll see you around. Sleep safe." I went into my apartment and put my things down before I checked my messages. That's when I saw them. Several messages from my Uber driver, asking me where I was, before saying that they were going to drop my ride since I was nowhere to be seen. I checked my purchases and saw that I had a $5 penalty fee for ordering an Uber but failing to show up for my ride. I was confused until I realized that the Uber I had just taken wasn't an Uber at all. I had gotten into a car with a man I didn't know, who probably didn't work for the company, who knew my name, and who also knew where I lived by memory. And I told him my gate code and that I lived completely alone. I called the police, but with no evidence, a name to look up, or a license plate, there was little they could do. Now, not only do I not drive, but I also don't take Uber. I know the man who drove me probably didn't work for Uber, but it's the thought of getting into a car with a complete stranger who will then know where you live that had me deleting my app. For those that still use the app, be smarter than me. Always look at the license plate. Never give your driver more details about yourself than needed, and never, ever give them the code to get past the only thing keeping you safe from them. About a week ago, my boyfriend Dean broke up with me over text. I was waiting for him at one of our favorite restaurants when he just messaged me out of nowhere, saying that he didn't want to see me again. I started crying, and as I didn't feel like eating anymore, I decided to just go home. I called an Uber and went outside to wait. I thought Dean and I were happy. His message completely blindsided me. Pretty soon, my Uber arrived. It was an old Nissan. I checked that the license plate number was the same, and then I looked at the driver to make sure he matched his photo. I'd heard some horror stories about people getting into the wrong cars, and I wanted to be careful. Everything seemed okay, so I got in. My driver was named Edward. He seemed really friendly, like he wanted to cheer me up. We drove for a bit in silence, and then he asked me if I was okay. Yes, I lied, but he didn't believe me. He tried to press the issue, but I told him that I didn't want to talk about it. He asked me if there was anything he could do, and I told him to just drive. It was about 9 at night and there wasn't much traffic. We rounded a corner, and I literally gasped out loud. The car was passing by an old Denny's, and I saw Dean in the parking lot. He was making out with my friend Jessica. I couldn't believe it. His hands were all over her. I could tell that this wasn't the first time they'd kissed. Edward asked me again if something was wrong, and this time I couldn't hold it in. I pointed toward Dean and said that he was my boyfriend. I didn't mention that he'd already broken up with me. Edward slowed down the car, looking at me through the rearview window. "You're sure?" he asked. I nodded. He mumbled something that I couldn't hear, and then he slowly drove into the Denny's parking lot. "What are you doing?" I shouted, but that didn't stop him. He drove right up to Dean and then parked. He kept the engine running. What was he going to do? I was too confused to say anything. I just watched as Edward casually got out of the car and casually walked over toward Dean. Dean was facing the other direction, so he didn't see my Uber driver. But Jessica did. She pushed herself off Dean and screamed. Dean spun around to see what had frightened her, and that's when Edward threw a sucker punch. Dean fell to the ground. I couldn't see him over the hood of the car, so I didn't know if he was still moving. In total panic, Jessica raced toward me. She slammed her hands against the window and screamed out, "Stop him!" Edward walked up behind her and pulled her back by the shirt. I could hear her whimpering through the closed window. It all happened so fast that my brain couldn't even register what was going on. As he threw her to the ground, I was finally able to get past my shock. I jumped out of the car and shouted for Edward to stop. Standing over Jessica, he turned to me and asked if I knew who she was. "Yes," I said. "She's my friend." "That makes things so much worse," he said. It looked like he was about to hurt her, but instead he let her go. She took a moment to catch her breath, and then she ran through the parking lot and into the distance. I looked over toward the Denny's, which had wide windows facing us, but no one inside seemed to notice or care what was going on. Now that I was out of the car, I could see Dean lying on the ground. Blood covered half his face, but he was still alive. He was slowly trying to push himself back to his feet. Edward smiled at me, like he'd just done me a big favor or something. He asked if I wanted him to finish the job. I screamed at him, "Why are you doing this?" "Because you look so sad," he said. "And I know firsthand what it's like to be cheated on." The man was insane. He stepped closer to Dean, who was almost standing up by this point. Edward was clenching his fists, ready to hit him again. I knew that he'd kill Dean if I didn't do something. I begged him to stop, and that he'd done enough and learned his lesson. Edward was muttering to himself now. I couldn't tell what he was saying, but it sounded like, "You're gonna get me in trouble." I didn't know what to do. I was too scared to pull him back, thinking he'd probably hurt me too. I begged Edward to leave him alone, and said if he left, we wouldn't call the police or report him to Uber. That seemed to work, because Edward looked at me and said, "Just remember, I know where you live." Dean looked at me, horrified. He could barely stand, still woozy from his pounding. I picked him up and I helped him back to his car. Jessica was nowhere to be seen. Dean agreed not to involve the police, as he didn't want the driver to come looking for me at home. I explained to Dean that I saw him and Jessica as I was going home and told the driver, "That's my friend and ex-boyfriend who just broke up with me by text." I told him that I had no idea my driver would do something like that. I said that I didn't ask him to, and Dean believed me. We never did report him to the police or Uber, but thankfully, we never saw him again either. I think I could tell there was something wrong the moment I got into the car. Usually because of the star rating system and the fact that the ratings affect how many bookings they get, drivers for Uber make a bit more of an effort when it comes to greeting you. Most will say hi, double check that they have the right address, and sometimes ask how your day has been or some other pleasantries. Obviously, there are some that are less social and will hardly say a word, but honestly, this time was different. I know it might sound odd, but it wasn't the fact that he didn't say anything when I got in the cab, but it was the way he didn't. It wasn't like he was just being ignorant or wasn't in the mood to talk. It was more like he wasn't there. As if he was there physically, but mentally, he had totally checked out. It's hard to explain, but there was a sort of absence, like a hole where the person should have been. I felt it as soon as I got in, and didn't feel it change until after what happened. I got in the car, threw my stuff on the seat beside me, and said the destination to him. I always do this, even though it should be on the app, and the guy should have the information in front of him already, just to make sure. The last thing you want is them driving off in the wrong direction, or taking you to somewhere completely different. Unfortunately, that's pretty much exactly what happened here. Initially, he was going the right way, turning left off the main road, up the hill toward the moors, and taking the hill trail over. It was a route I'd done with Uber drivers hundreds of times, and seemed to be the way they preferred because it cut out the traffic on the high street and the main roads below. Essentially, it involved taking the huge hill out of town, so you were eventually looking down on it, and then speeding along the country lane by the cemetery and a few farms until you came down on the other side of the hill and back towards civilization. When I was a kid and walking the journey, we used to call it going over the tops, because you basically walked over the town and the traffic by going up and around it. That was what I thought this guy was doing. When we got to the flat at the top of the hill, however, instead of following the trail around and back down into the next town, he suddenly took a left down some deserted track. I remember I leaned forward and told him he was going the wrong way. He pointed to the sat-nav without saying a word and continued driving. When I insisted that the sat-nav was wrong, that I'd been doing the journey for years, and that he was clearly going in exactly the wrong direction, again, he didn't respond. But he did lock the internal doors. At that point, I raised my voice, telling him to stop the car, to let me out and stop the journey right then and there. Had this been pre-COVID, I might have reached for him or made some desperate attempt to make him stop. But since the pandemic, a lot of cabs have that large perspex screen between the back seat and the front, meaning that I couldn't have swung for him or reached forward even if I'd wanted to. Taking my phone from my pocket, I told him that I was calling the police and demanded that he stop, which, to my surprise, he did. I don't know if it was the fact we were out of town or that he had some kind of blocker in the car, but there was no signal. I couldn't call the police even if I wanted to. Throwing the phone to one side, I looked around myself and realized all at once where the car had come to a stop. He had stopped at a place that, as kids, we used to call Devil's Leap. I'm not sure what the real name for it is, but basically, it's a precipice. Part of an old quarry that looks down over the reservoir. The drop from the wired fence cliff edge down to the water below is about 100 meters, and there were all kinds of stories of people jumping or pushing people off. Now my Uber driver had parked, facing that cliff, the front wheels literally 10 feet from the point where the ground gave way, and the sheer drop plummeted down to the water below. His headlights were still on, the engine still running, but he wasn't saying a word. In a panic, I tried the door handles, pulling and kicking at the windows, trying to get out. Was this guy seriously about to drive off the edge? To drive off with me still in the back? I suddenly had visions of us flying off the peak, the crash and sudden burst of freezing black as the car hit the water. How, even if I survived the fall, I would be strapped inside, slowly sinking as water began flowing in, ice cold and dark all around me. I screamed and screamed, banging on the perspex barrier, pleading with him to turn around to turn off the car and to let me out. Instead, he took off the handbrake and edged a little closer. A foot, 2 feet. With every second that he rolled, he came a little closer to the edge and falling off the peak completely. He stopped, pulled up the handbrake, The front wheel's now literally a foot from the edge, and took a coin off the dashboard. Holding it up for me to see, he held it between his fingers, then flipped it. Heads. Looking at the coin, he sat for a moment in complete silence, then reversed the car, out and back to the road. He then proceeded to wordlessly complete the journey as if nothing had happened. Around 2 minutes from my front door, the car stopped again. This time, though, the driver pulled over and burst out from the driver's seat and onto the pavement, where he threw up violently. It's a horrible detail to include, but I noticed that the vomit looked like blood and looked to be steaming hot. As he straightened up, he suddenly seemed to see me kicking against the door. Unlocking the internal doors, he let me out and began at once to apologize, tears streaming down his cheeks. All he kept saying over and over was that he didn't know what had happened. He was in tears, pulling at his hair with both hands and desperately begging me not to report him. I don't remember picking you up. The last thing I remember, I was sitting in the supermarket car park waiting for a call, but then, when did you get in? I mean, how did we get, what the hell is happening? I don't know what he said next, because having grabbed my phone and bag, I sprinted, running as fast as I could away from the car, away from the driver and whatever was happening to him. I wrote to Uber later that night and reported the incident to the police. Apparently, the driver has since been banned from the app and no longer works for them. The police didn't tell me a thing. What I can tell you, though, is that about a week later, I got a letter through my front door. Obviously, the driver still had my address from the pickup. At first, I thought it was going to be a hate-filled rant about how I got him fired. Instead, it was an apology asking for forgiveness. He was apologizing for whatever happened on that journey. In the letter, the driver, whose name I won't share, insisted that he has no recollection of what happened for about 20 minutes before he picked me up. He insists that nothing like that has ever happened to him before, that he has no history of mental illness or any medical conditions that would account for him having simply blacked out without cause. He states in the letter that he's given up driving and is seeking psychological help. He also said that although he wasn't Catholic, he also arranged to meet with a priest. Though, of course, I don't like to think about or entertain for one moment what that might be meant to imply.